Someone knew the murder before it occurred. Welcome to Cafe Echoes. I am your host, Silas Graves. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Your voices mean a lot here. Let's begin. Mr. Poirot, she said, extending both hands with the air of a sovereign conferring favor. You are kindness itself. And Captain Hastings, how delightful. You make my little evening feel almost historical. Poirot bowed over her hand with grave elegance. Madame, an evening in your house could never be little. Her eyes flickered with satisfaction. You shall say the same after supper, I hope. That, said Poirot gently, depends upon the supper. She laughed, a low, controlled laugh, and turned to greet a cabinet minister just arriving with the expression of a man approaching taxation. I glanced at Poirot. He had already begun his quiet inspection of the room, that extraordinary and disconcerting survey of his which missed nothing and yet never seemed rude. He noticed how a woman in emerald silk avoided the gaze of a younger man near the windows, how a white-haired judge accepted a glass with fingers that trembled slightly, how a pale, dark-eyed guest in foreign evening dress appeared less interested in conversation than in counting the doors. You observe the miniatures, I suggested. No, Hastings. I observe the people who pretend to observe the miniatures. This inner circle, as I soon discovered, was a curious and rather brilliant collection. There was Lady Imogen's niece, Miss Sylvia Vexley, a fair-haired girl of 24, with a frank expression that seemed at first glance charmingly unguarded. Yet there was in her laughter a trace of strain, as though gaiety had lately become a duty. Beside her hovered Mr. Adrian Kellett, a rising political secretary, dark, neatly handsome, and so perfectly turned out that he looked almost rehearsed. He had the habit, common among ambitious young men, of listening with half his attention while preparing his own next remark. Dr. Basil Annesley was there too, a fashionable physician whose success had not cured him of impatience. He was broad-shouldered, smooth-faced, and carried his confidence like a well-cut coat. One felt that he expected human beings to behave sensibly and was offended when they did not. Mr. Lucian Hadrick, the art dealer who had apparently advised Lady Imogen on her acquisition, was a thin, elegant fellow with exquisite cuffs and restless eyes, and he spoke with refined enthusiasm of Florentine schools and the tragic vulgarity of modern framing. But one had the impression that his true religion was valuation. Then there was Mrs. Viola Trent, a widow with striking dark beauty and a voice like velvet drawn over steel. She was seated much of the time beside Judge Elmore, who had retired from the bench, yet retained something judicial in the downward tilt of his mouth. Mrs. Trent spoke little, but when she did, others listened. Finally, there was the man who, though the least impressive in appearance, somehow drew my attention most. He was introduced to us as Mr. Felix Lorne. I remember him clearly. Medium height, narrow shoulders, an ordinary evening coat, a face that might have passed unnoticed anywhere, and yet did not. His features were not remarkable. It was his manner that arrested one. He seemed perpetually to be listening for something beneath the conversation. When addressed, he answered readily enough, even pleasantly, but his eyes never quite lost their look of anticipation, as if the evening for him were not proceeding but approaching. "He is nervous," I murmured. Poirot's head inclined almost imperceptibly. "Yes, but not of the usual sort. Most nervous people fear what may happen to them. This one fears what he expects to happen." At that moment, Lady Imogen clapped her hands softly and announced that those remaining for supper might follow her upstairs. We moved through the gallery, a long room lined with glass cases and lit by shaded lamps, where the famous miniatures lay displayed like secret jewels. Guests paused, admired, and exclaimed. Lucian Hadrick fluttered near the cases like an anxious curator-priest, correcting misconceptions with exquisite tact. Poirot paused before one tiny portrait of a woman in blue velvet. "She has the face," he observed, "of one who forgives as and never forgets." 16th century, said Heydrich lightly, though I dare say your interpretation is more modern. No, said Poirot. Human nature, it is never modern. We passed on. The supper room had been arranged with intimate magnificence. A long oval table gleamed with silver and crystal. Tall candles rose from low banks of white lilies. Place cards in Lady Imogen's severe hand directed the seating with military precision. I found myself between Miss Sylvia and Judge Elmore. Poirot sat opposite me, placed between Lady Imogen and Mrs. Trent. Mr. Felix Lorne was farther down, near Dr. Annesley and Mr. Heydrich. Conversation began easily enough. There was that pleasant surface sparkle which belongs to expensive dinners where the wines are well chosen and everyone suspects everyone else of importance. Politics, pictures, a royal rumor, some theatrical scandal, these topics moved about the table, each growing fainter as dishes succeeded one another. Yet beneath it all I became increasingly conscious of strain. Sylvia Vexley, though charming, kept glancing toward her aunt with the apprehension of one awaiting a verdict. Adrian Kellett spoke to her in undertones whenever Lady Imogen's attention turned away, but on each occasion the girl answered shortly. Mrs. Trent avoided looking at Dr. Annesley. Judge Elmore, when once spoken to about a recent memoir of criminal cases, replied with an abruptness bordering on rudeness. Even Felix Lorne, ordinary, forgettable Felix Lorne, drank almost no wine and started visibly when a servant at his elbow dropped a spoon. Poirot, whose conversation throughout appeared devoted to the relative merits of Belgian and French cookery, missed none of it. Lady Imogen, I noticed, dominated the table without ever seeming to do so. A raised eyebrow from her could redirect a subject. A phrase of silky amusement could reduce a guest to caution. She was not merely hostess. She was conductor. It was during the remove before the suite that the thing happened. A footman had entered and bent discreetly to Lady Imogen. She listened, frowned very slightly, and then rose. "You must forgive me for 2 minutes," she said. "A matter concerning the housekeeper. I pray do not stir. I shall be back before anyone has had time to become interesting." There was a polite murmur. She swept out. Her chair remained empty at the head of the table. For perhaps 10 seconds, conversation continued, though unevenly. Then it thinned away. One realized, absurdly enough, how much of the room's animation had proceeded from that single controlling will. And in the small hush that followed, Felix Lorne spoke. It was not loud. Indeed, had all been talking at once. I might not have heard it. But every voice had died, and his words fell with distinct clarity into the candle-lit stillness. "When she comes back," he said, staring at the empty chair, "she will be dead." No one moved. I think at first we all believed we had misunderstood. There was no drama in his tone, no drunken flourish, no attempt at wit. He had spoken as a man might remark upon rain. Dr. Annesley gave a short laugh. "Come, Mr. Lorne, really." Lorne blinked as if waking. He looked round at us and went white to the lips. I beg your pardon," he stammered. "A most unfortunate expression. I meant only, that is to say, one hears such idiotic things in one's head." Mrs. Trent had set down her glass with a tiny click. Sylvia stared at him. Adrian Kellett said sharply, "What exactly do you mean by that?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing." Judge Elmore's heavy face had altered. "You are aware, sir, that that is a singular remark to make." Yes, of course." Lorne drew out a handkerchief and touched his forehead. "I'm ashamed. I have not been sleeping. I say absurd things." Poirot had not changed expression. He merely folded his hands and looked at the man with grave, undetached interest. "How curious," he said softly, "that the absurd things are so often specific." Lorne turned toward him almost wildly. "Monsieur Poirot, I assure you." He got no farther. From the corridor beyond the dining room came a sound, a heavy, muffled fall, followed instantly by a woman's scream. For one frozen instant, no one at the table moved. Then chairs crashed back. Dr. Annesley was first to the door, with Kellett at his shoulder. I was only a pace behind. The cry had come from the gallery. Lady Imogen Vexley lay at the foot of the short staircase leading from the upper passage, her black satin spread about her on the pale carpet, one white hand flung outward, the pearls at her throat broken and glimmering like spilled drops of milk. A maid was kneeling beside her in terror. A silver tray had rolled to the wall. Dr. Annesley dropped to one knee, felt swiftly for pulse and heartbeat, then looked up. His face had gone hard. "She is dead," he said. Behind us, in the doorway, Felix Lorne gave a choking sound, and Hercule Poirot, very still, lifted his eyes from the body to the man who had foretold the death before it happened. For several seconds the gallery was filled with confusion, voices overlapping, the maid sobbing hysterically, chairs scraping from the dining room as the remaining guests crowded into the passage. Someone began asking questions all at once. Someone else suggested a doctor, only to be reminded that Dr. Annesley was already kneeling beside the body. The physician worked quickly and with professional composure. He examined the throat, lifted an eyelid, and pressed his fingers once more against the wrist. "It is no use," he said quietly. "She has been dead perhaps half a minute." "Dead?" Sylvia Vexley repeated faintly from behind me. Her voice had a brittle sound. Adrian Kellett's hand closed around her arm, steadying her. How did it happen?" he demanded. Dr. Annesley glanced at the stair above. "She appears to have fallen." "But she had scarcely left the room," Mrs. Trent said. Judge Elmore's deep voice cut through the murmuring. "Stand back, please. Give the doctor air." It was at that moment that I became aware of Poirot beside me. While the others had surged forward, he had approached with a curious deliberation. His gaze moved from Lady Imogen's still form to the staircase, then along the carpeted passage, then to the small side table where the silver tray had come to rest. He knelt, not beside the body, but near the first stair. "Ah, Hastings," he said softly. "Yes?" "Observe." I followed his gesture. On the polished wooden edge of the step, half concealed by shadow, something glinted faintly. It was a thin thread, so fine it was nearly invisible, stretched tightly across the width of the stair at ankle height. I felt a sudden chill. Good Lord! Poirot did not touch it. Instead, he leaned closer, examining the fastening point where the thread had been secured discreetly to the carved banister. "Très intéressant," he murmured. Dr. Annesley looked up sharply. "What have you found?" Poirot rose slowly. "I think, Doctor, that Lady Imogen did not simply fall." The words fell into the gallery like a dropped stone. Adrian Kellett stared. "What do you mean?" Poirot indicated the step with a graceful movement of the hand. "A small device, placed here with great precision. In the dim light, one would never see it. Lady Imogen descends the stairs, catches the foot, and voila." "A trap," Judge Elmore said. "Precisely." Sylvia gave a small cry. "But that means that someone intended her death," Poirot finished gently. There was a moment of absolute silence. The implications were swift and terrible. This had not been accident or misfortune. It had been murder. Planned, prepared, and executed within a house full of witnesses. And suddenly, every person in that passage became acutely conscious of the others. Mrs. Trent stepped back slightly from Dr. Annesley. Heydrich's elegant face had gone pale. Kellett's jaw tightened as he glanced instinctively toward Sylvia. Judge Elmore's heavy brows drew together with judicial gravity. Only Felix Lorne stood as if turned to stone. His eyes were fixed upon the body. Poirot turned toward him. "Mon ami," he said quietly, "you appear distressed." Lorne swallowed. I should think anyone would be. Yes, but not everyone predicted the death in advance. The words were spoken mildly, yet they seemed to strike the air with force. Every head turned. Lorne's lips trembled. I told you, it was nothing, a foolish remark. Perhaps, said Poirot. Dr. Annesley rose briskly. Whatever the explanation, we must send for the police at once. Judge Elmore nodded. Quite right. Kellett moved toward the nearest servant. Have the telephone used immediately. Within minutes, the household had fallen into that strange, hushed order which follows sudden catastrophe. The body was covered with a cloak and left undisturbed under Dr. Annesley's supervision. The servants withdrew in frightened clusters, and one footman was dispatched to summon the police. No one returned to the dining room. Instead, the small party gathered in the drawing room below, where the fire burned brightly and the flowers looked suddenly indecently cheerful. I remember that no one chose a seat immediately. People moved restlessly about the room, pausing near the windows or the mantelpiece, speaking in subdued fragments. Sylvia sat at last near the fire, her face pale and rigid. Kellett remained beside her. Mrs. Trent stood near the piano, her dark eyes thoughtful. Heydrich had taken out a cigarette, but forgotten to light it. Judge Elmore paced slowly with hands clasped behind his back. Felix Lorne hovered near the door like a man contemplating escape, yet unable to take the first step. Poirot alone seemed entirely composed, as he had selected a chair slightly apart from the others, and now sat with fingertips pressed together, watching the room with the calm patience of a chess player considering the board. I joined him. Extraordinary, I whispered. Yes. You believe it was deliberate murder? Poirot lifted his brows. My friend, the thread upon the stair, what else could it be? But who could have placed it there? Lady Imogen left the dining room only a moment before the accident. Just so. And the rest of us were still seated. Almost all? Almost? Poirot looked toward the door. The servants, Hastings? I frowned. But surely none of them would. Poirot gave a small dismissive wave. Perhaps not. But let us remember, the thread must have been fixed before Lady Imogen left the room. The murderer could not rely upon knowing the exact moment she would ascend or descend the stairs. Therefore, the trap must have been prepared earlier. You mean during the reception? Or even before it? That thought gave me pause. The gallery had been open to the guests for nearly half an hour before supper. Anyone could have passed along the staircase. Still, I said slowly, that doesn't explain Mr. Lorne's remark. No, Poirot agreed softly. That is the most curious feature. At that moment, Felix Lorne spoke from across the room. I must insist that my words had nothing to do with what occurred. He addressed the room generally, though his gaze avoided Poirot. Judge Elmore stopped pacing. Then perhaps you will explain what prompted them. I told you, it was merely a figure of speech. A singularly unfortunate one. Mrs. Trent's voice entered smoothly. Perhaps Mr. Lorne meant that Lady Imogen's health was fragile. Lorne seized upon the suggestion eagerly. Yes, exactly. Dr. Annesley, who had just entered from the hall, shook his head. That explanation will not do. Lady Imogen was in excellent condition. I examined her only last month. The silence that followed seemed heavier than before. Poirot rose. He crossed the room slowly until he stood directly before Felix Lorne. My dear monsieur, he said gently, when you spoke those words at the table, you looked not at Lady Imogen, but at the empty chair. Lorne stared. Poirot continued quietly, which suggests that you were not speaking of her health. You were speaking of an event. The man's hands began to shake. I don't understand what you imply. Poirot's voice remained courteous. I imply nothing. I merely observe. A clock on the mantel struck the quarter hour, and in the stillness that followed, the distant sound of a motor car approached outside in Belgrave Square. The police had arrived. Poirot's eyes moved once more to Felix Lorne, and there was something in his expression now. Not accusation, not certainty, but the first faint spark of interest that appears when his little grey cells have detected the outline of a most unusual puzzle. "The murder foretold," he murmured quietly to me. "Yes," I said. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "But the question, Hastings, is not merely how Lady Imogen died." His gaze lingered on Felix Lorne. "It is how one man knew the murder before it happened." The arrival of the police introduced a new and sharper energy into the house. And a tall inspector with a lean face and deliberate manner entered the drawing room accompanied by a uniformed constable. His name, we soon learned, was Inspector Cartwright of Scotland Yard. Judge Elmore stepped forward at once, his legal instincts asserting themselves. "Inspector, I regret to inform you that Lady Imogen Vexley is dead. There has been, at least it appears, an accident upon the staircase." Poirot gave the slightest cough. An accident prepared with remarkable care. Inspector Cartwright turned his head. His eyes rested upon Poirot for a brief moment, measuring him with professional curiosity. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, if I'm not mistaken." Poirot inclined his head. "At your service, Inspector." Cartwright gave a faint nod that suggested respect without surrendering authority. "Well then perhaps you would show me what you found." Within a few minutes we had returned to the gallery. The body remained where it had fallen, now respectfully covered. The house was quiet in that unnatural way that follows sudden tragedy. Somewhere below, a door closed softly, and distant footsteps retreated. Inspector Cartwright crouched at the staircase while Poirot indicated the thread. The inspector examined it closely, producing a small pocket torch. "Fine silk," he said at last. "Practically invisible in this light." "Just so. And secured neatly to the banister." "Yes." Cartwright rose slowly. "Which means," he said thoughtfully, "that someone set a trap." "Exactly." The inspector looked down at the still figure on the carpet. "A simple device," he said, "but effective. And a fall from the top stair, particularly if the victim is taken unawares, could easily break the neck." Dr. Annesley, who had accompanied us, nodded grimly. "That is precisely what has occurred." Cartwright straightened. "Very well. No one leaves the house tonight." There was a faint stir among the guests who had followed us into the gallery. Mrs. Trent folded her arms. "Inspector, surely you cannot imagine that one of us—" "I imagine nothing yet, madam," he replied calmly. "But the circumstances make it necessary to treat everyone present as a potential witness." His gaze moved across the group. Adrian Kellett's face hardened. "This is absurd. There were 30 people here earlier this evening." "And how many remained for supper?" 8, said Poirot quietly. The inspector glanced at him. Then it seems we begin with 8. Felix Lorne shifted uneasily. "I assure you I know nothing about any thread on the staircase." "No one has suggested that you do," said Cartwright mildly. "But you might," Poirot added softly. "Tell us something else." Lorne looked at him helplessly. "You refer again to what I said at the table?" "Yes." Inspector Cartwright frowned slightly. "What remark is this?" Judge Elmore spoke. "Just before the accident occurred, Mr. Lorne stated, quite plainly, that when Lady Imogen returned to the table, she would be dead." The inspector's eyebrows rose. "Indeed." All eyes turned once more toward Felix Lorne. The man's face had become almost grey. "I told you, it was an unfortunate expression." Cartwright regarded him steadily. "Mr. Lorne, I think you had better explain precisely what you meant." Lorne hesitated, and the silence stretched. At last he spoke, his voice strained. "I did not mean anything specific. I have been under a good deal of nervous pressure lately. I sometimes say foolish things." Poirot tilted his head. And yet the foolish thing proved correct. "That was coincidence?" Perhaps. Inspector Cartwright folded his arms. You understand, Mr. Lorne, that predicting a death moments before it occurs places you in a rather awkward position. I had no idea she would fall. Fall? Poirot repeated softly. Lorne blinked. Yes, fall. That is what happened, isn't it? No, said Poirot gently. What happened was murder. For a moment, Lorne looked as if he might collapse. Inspector Cartwright studied him closely. Have you known Lady Imogen long? Only a few months. How did you come to be invited tonight? She met me at a charity function. What is your profession? I deal in financial consulting. Poirot's eyes flickered briefly toward Lucien Heydrich. Interesting, he murmured. Cartwright made a small note in his pocket-book. We will discuss your circumstances later, Mr. Lorne. He turned then to the others. For the moment, I should like a clear account of the events immediately preceding Lady Imogen's death. Dr. Annesley spoke first. She left the dining room roughly 2 minutes before the accident. A servant had informed her of some domestic matter. Did anyone accompany her? No. Inspector Cartwright nodded. And all of you remained seated? Yes, said Adrian Kellett firmly. Until we heard the fall, added Mrs. Trent. Cartwright looked at Poirot. You observed nothing unusual before she left the table? Poirot considered. Only that the atmosphere of the company was perhaps a little, how shall we say, tense. That is hardly unusual at dinner parties. True, but in this case the tension had several distinct directions. Cartwright's interest sharpened. Explain. Poirot gestured lightly toward the group. Mademoiselle Sylvia appeared anxious. Monsieur Kellett attentive but preoccupied. Madame Trent avoided conversation with the doctor. Monsieur Heydrich watched the gallery more closely than the food. And Monsieur Lorne. He paused. Inspector Cartwright waited. Monsieur Lorne appeared to expect something. Every eye turned once more toward the unfortunate man. Lorne's voice cracked. Oh, you make it sound as though I planned the whole affair. Poirot smiled faintly. No, monsieur. If you had planned it, you would not have announced it. Inspector Cartwright gave a small grunt of amusement. That's sound reasoning. He closed his notebook. Very well. We shall take individual statements shortly. At that moment, a constable approached from the staircase. Sir, we found something upstairs. What is it? A small spool of silk thread, sir, hidden behind a cabinet in the gallery. Cartwright looked sharply toward Poirot. Convenient. Or careless, said Poirot. The inspector nodded. Either way, someone set that trap. His gaze moved slowly across the group. There are 8 people who could have done it. Poirot folded his hands behind his back. Yes. Inspector Cartwright glanced at him again, and one man who somehow knew it was about to happen. Felix Lorne lowered his head into his shaking hands. Poirot watched him for a long moment. Then he murmured quietly to me, My friend Hastings, already we see the outline of a most delicate psychological problem. In what way? Poirot's eyes gleamed faintly. Because if Monsieur Lorne truly knew the murder would occur, he paused. Then either he is the murderer. Poirot looked slowly around the silent gallery, or someone wished him to appear to be. Inspector Cartwright decided that the drawing room would serve best for the questioning. The gallery above had become too closely associated with the tragedy. Even the most composed among us seemed unwilling to linger near the staircase where Lady Imogen had fallen. But the constables remained upstairs to guard the scene while the rest of us returned below. A quiet fire still burned in the grate, though the room now seemed colder than before. Cartwright took a seat at a small writing table and opened his notebook again. A constable stood near the door. Poirot remained slightly apart from the group, leaning lightly upon the back of a chair with that air of serene patience which always suggested he was already several moves ahead in the game. "Let us begin with the simplest point," said the inspector. "Lady Imogen left the dining room in response to a message from a servant. Who delivered that message? The maid who had been attending the table was summoned. She entered nervously, twisting her apron in her hands. "Yes, sir," she said. "What did you tell Lady Imogen?" The housekeeper asked if her ladyship could come upstairs for a moment, sir. Something about the arrangements for tomorrow. Cartwright frowned slightly. "And where is the housekeeper now?" "In the kitchen, sir." "Very well, you may go." The maid hurried away with visible relief. Inspector Cartwright turned back to us. "That explains why Lady Imogen left the table. Now we must determine whether anyone had an opportunity to place that thread on the stair before she reached it." Lucian Hedrick spoke first. "The gallery was open during the reception. Guests wandered about freely examining the miniatures. Anyone might have passed the staircase." "Quite," said Cartwright. "But the thread appears to have been fixed only recently. The knot was fresh. A servant told me the gallery had been cleaned earlier this evening." "Then the trap must have been prepared after the guests arrived," said Judge Elmore. "That would appear so." Sylvia Vexley shivered slightly. "But why would anyone do such a thing?" Her voice sounded fragile. Poirot answered gently. "Because, mademoiselle, someone wished to ensure that Lady Imogen would die tonight." Adrian Kellett spoke sharply. "That is obvious. The question is, who?" Cartwright nodded. "Exactly. And to answer that, we must consider motive as well as opportunity." His gaze moved to Sylvia. "Miss Vexley, you are Lady Imogen's niece?" "Yes." "And you live here?" "Yes." "Would you inherit her estate?" The girl hesitated, clearly distressed by the bluntness of the question. I suppose so. I am her only close relative." Adrian Kellett intervened quickly. Surely you cannot imply." "I imply nothing," said Cartwright calmly. "I merely establish facts." Sylvia lowered her eyes. "My aunt was very kind to me." Poirot watched her quietly but said nothing. The inspector made a brief note and turned toward Lucian Hedrick. "You advised Lady Imogen in the purchase of the miniature collection?" "Yes." "Was there any dispute over the transaction?" "Certainly not. The pieces are genuine and quite valuable." Poirot interjected mildly. "But the value depends somewhat upon the reputation of the dealer, does it not?" Hedrick stiffened. "My reputation is excellent." "Of course," said Poirot smoothly. Inspector Cartwright moved on. "Dr. Annesley, how long had you known Lady Imogen?" "Nearly 10 years. Any reason to wish her harm?" "None whatever." "And Mrs. Trent?" The dark-haired woman met the inspector's gaze steadily. "I knew Lady Imogen socially, nothing more." Poirot's eyes lingered on her face for a moment as though measuring something unspoken. At last, Cartwright turned to Felix Lorne. "Now, Mr. Lorne." The man looked utterly exhausted. "You will have to explain 2 matters. First, your connection with Lady Imogen. Second, your extraordinary remark at the table." Lorne ran a trembling hand across his forehead. "I met her several months ago at a charity event. She took an interest in some financial proposals I'd prepared." "What kind of proposals?" "Investment arrangements." "For her?" "Yes." "Were they successful?" Lorne hesitated. "There were complications." Poirot spoke quietly. "What kind of complications, monsieur?" "Market fluctuations." "Ah." Inspector Cartwright leaned forward slightly. "Did Lady Imogen lose money?" Lorne's voice dropped. "A considerable sum." A murmur moved through the room. Sylvia looked up in surprise. "My aunt never mentioned that." "She intended to recover the losses," Lorne said quickly. "I assured her the situation could be corrected." "Yet she invited you to supper tonight," said Cartwright. "Yes." "Why?" Lorne hesitated again. "She wished to discuss the matter privately." Poirot's voice came gently. "Was she angry?" The man swallowed. "She was dissatisfied." Inspector Cartwright closed his notebook slowly. "That establishes motive rather neatly, Mr. Lorne." "I did not kill her." No one has said that you did, but your prediction of her death is difficult to overlook. Lorne looked helplessly from face to face. I cannot explain it. Poirot watched him thoughtfully. You spoke as though you expected something to happen. Yes, but not this. What then? Lorne opened his mouth, then closed it again. I cannot say. Inspector Cartwright's voice hardened slightly. You had better. Lorne shook his head. I gave my word. Your word to whom? He did not answer. The silence grew heavy. At last Poirot spoke softly. Inspector, perhaps Monsieur Lorne's difficulty lies not in guilt, but in fear. Cartwright looked at him. Fear of what? Poirot's gaze moved slowly round the room. Fear of the person who truly arranged this little trap. A faint shiver seemed to pass through the company. Mrs. Trent spoke coolly. You suggest that someone warned Mr. Lorne beforehand? Possibly. Why? Poirot smiled faintly. To create a witness. Inspector Cartwright frowned. A witness to what? Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. To the inevitability of Lady Imogen's death. Sylvia whispered, but that is monstrous. Yes, said Poirot quietly. Very monstrous. At that moment the housekeeper entered the room pale and trembling. Inspector, there is something you should see upstairs. Cartwright rose at once. What is it? The woman hesitated. It concerns Lady Imogen's writing desk. Poirot's eyes sharpened slightly. Oh? Yes, sir, the housekeeper said nervously. There is a letter there, written only this evening. Inspector Cartwright frowned. What about it? The woman swallowed. It says that Lady Imogen believed someone in this house intended to murder her tonight. The announcement seemed to strike the room like a physical blow. Yet for several seconds, no one spoke. Inspector Cartwright looked sharply at the housekeeper. You are certain of that? Yes, sir. I saw the letter myself when I went to her ladyship's room just now. Why did you go there? I thought perhaps she had gone upstairs after the accident. I wished to see if there was anything needed. Cartwright nodded. Very well. Show us. Within moments, we were again ascending the staircase, though this time by the opposite corridor, the gallery having been sealed by the constables. The house felt strangely altered now. The warm elegance of the earlier evening had vanished, replaced by the oppressive stillness that always seems to accompany violent death. Lady Imogen's private sitting room lay at the far end of the passage. The housekeeper opened the door and stepped aside. The room was large, orderly, so and unmistakably its owner's domain. Bookshelves lined one wall. A writing desk stood near the window. A single lamp burned upon it, casting a circle of steady light over papers arranged with almost military precision. Inspector Cartwright crossed to the desk. There, said the housekeeper, pointing. A sheet of thick cream paper lay beneath a silver paperweight. Cartwright lifted it carefully. He read in silence for a moment. Then his brows rose slightly. Well, he said. What does it say? Asked Judge Elmore. The inspector read aloud. My dear Elmore, if anything should happen to me tonight, you will perhaps remember that I spoke to you last week of my suspicions. I have reason to believe that someone among those invited to supper intends my death. I do not yet know which of them it may be, but the signs have become too clear to ignore. Now, nevertheless, I shall not cancel the dinner. I prefer to confront danger openly. Should the worst occur, I trust you will ensure that the truth is discovered. Imogen Vexley. When he finished, the room seemed even quieter than before. Judge Elmore's face had grown grave. Yes, he said slowly. She did speak to me of certain concerns. Inspector Cartwright turned sharply. You knew she feared for her life. I knew she suspected someone was attempting to defraud her financially. I did not realize she believed the matter had escalated to murder. Felix Lorne gave a faint gasp. Defraud her? Cartwright looked at him. You mentioned earlier that Lady Imogen had lost money through your investments. That was temporary. Poirot spoke gently. Monsieur, How much money? Lorne hesitated. Nearly £50,000. Even Cartwright seemed taken aback. That is not a trivial loss. No, Lorne whispered. Sylvia Vexley looked stunned. My aunt never said a word to me. Poirot's eyes moved thoughtfully around the room. Perhaps she preferred to settle the matter quietly. Inspector Cartwright folded the letter and slipped it into an evidence envelope. This document changes things considerably. How so? Asked Mrs. Trent. It establishes that Lady Imogen believed someone present tonight wished her dead. Which suggests she suspected one of us, said Adrian Kellett grimly. Exactly. The inspector turned to the housekeeper. Did Lady Imogen behave unusually this evening? No, sir. She seemed quite herself. Did she receive any visitors earlier today? The housekeeper hesitated. There was one gentleman who called this afternoon. Who? She glanced nervously toward Felix Lorne. Mr. Lorne, sir. All eyes turned toward him again. Lorne looked as if he might faint. Yes, he said weakly. I came to discuss the investments. Inspector Cartwright's voice hardened. What was the outcome of that conversation? She was angry, very angry. Did she threaten you? She said she intended to inform the authorities if the money was not recovered immediately. That sounds reasonable, said Cartwright. Lorne spread his hands helplessly. I told her I would resolve the matter. Poirot tilted his head slightly. Did she believe you? No. The word came out almost as a whisper. Inspector Cartwright made another note. That gives you a very clear motive, Mr. Lorne. I know how it appears, but I swear I did not set that trap. Poirot regarded him quietly. You are telling the truth about that. Cartwright glanced sideways at him. You're certain? Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Yes. And why is that? Poirot walked slowly around the desk, examining the neat rows of papers. Because Monsieur Lorne made a mistake. A mistake? Yes. If he had planned the murder, he would never have spoken at the table. Inspector Cartwright considered this. That is logical. But, Poirot continued softly, someone wanted him to speak. The inspector frowned. Explain. Poirot turned toward Felix Lorne. Monsieur, earlier you said you gave your word not to reveal something. Lorne looked miserable. Yes. To whom? The man hesitated again. Poirot's voice became very gentle. To the person who told you that Lady Imogen would die tonight. Lorne's head snapped up. How did you... Poirot smiled faintly. It was the only explanation that fits the facts. Inspector Cartwright leaned forward. Are you saying someone warned Mr. Lorne beforehand? Yes. Why would they do that? So that when the death occurred, said Poirot quietly, his remark would make him appear guilty. The room fell silent. Mrs. Trent spoke slowly. You mean the murderer deliberately arranged for Mr. Lorne to incriminate himself? Precisely. Inspector Cartwright looked back at Lorne. Is that true? The man sank into a chair. Yes, he whispered. Who spoke to you? Lorne rubbed his face with shaking hands. I cannot say. You must. I promised. Cartwright's voice became sharp. A woman is dead. Lorne looked up helplessly. I know, but if I speak, that person will destroy me. Poirot studied him carefully. Destroy you how? Financially, socially, completely. A faint spark appeared in Poirot's eyes. Ah. Inspector Cartwright crossed his arms. Mr. Lorne, you will either tell us now or explain yourself at Scotland Yard. The man seemed on the verge of collapse. At last he whispered, All right. The room seemed to hold its breath. It was someone here tonight. Poirot nodded slowly. Of course. Lorne looked around the room with visible dread. That person came to me before dinner and said something terrible. What? Lorne's voice trembled. They said Lady Imogen would be dead before the night was over. Inspector Cartwright leaned forward. And who said that? Lorne closed his eyes. The same person, he whispered, who wrote that letter encouraging her to attend the dinner. The words hung in the lamplit room like a sudden draught of cold air. Inspector Cartwright's expression sharpened immediately. Explain yourself, he said. Felix Lorne lifted his head slowly. His face had the exhausted pallor of a man who had reached the end of resistance. I cannot prove it, he said hoarsely, but I know it is true. Poirot spoke gently. Monsieur, you believe the author of Lady Imogen's letter is the same person who warned you? Yes. Inspector Cartwright frowned. But the letter was written by Lady Imogen herself. Exactly. Lorne swallowed. That is what they told her to write. For a moment, no one spoke. Judge Elmore broke the silence first. That is an extraordinary claim, Mr. Lorne. I know. Did Lady Imogen tell you she had been instructed to write such a letter? No. Then how do you know? Lorne hesitated. Because the person who spoke to me said it. Inspector Cartwright leaned forward slightly. You had better start from the beginning. Lorne clasped his hands together tightly. I arrived early this evening, about half an hour before the other dinner guests. Sylvia looked up in surprise. You were here before us? Yes. Lady Imogen had asked me to come so we could discuss the investments privately before dinner. Did you see her? Cartwright asked. Yes. And how did that conversation go? She was furious. The memory seemed to shake him again. She accused me of deceiving her. She said she intended to bring legal action unless the money was restored immediately. Judge Elmore nodded slightly, and as though that sounded very much like Lady Imogen. What happened next? Asked the inspector. I left her sitting room. A servant showed me into the gallery to wait until the other guests arrived. Poirot's eyes brightened faintly. The gallery with the staircase? Yes. Were you alone? For a few minutes. And then? Someone came to speak to me. Inspector Cartwright's voice grew very quiet. Who? Lorne shook his head. I cannot. You must. I did not see their face clearly. Why not? The lights were low in the gallery. Poirot interjected softly. But you recognized the voice. Lorne looked at him with miserable admiration. Yes. Then the identity of the person is not in doubt. No. Yet you hesitate to name them. Yes. Inspector Cartwright tapped his pencil sharply against the notebook. Mr. Lorne, and if you continue to withhold information, you may find yourself charged with obstruction. Lorne flinched. Poirot stepped forward slightly. Permit me, Inspector. Cartwright gave a brief nod. Poirot spoke quietly to Lorne. This person approached you before dinner and told you that Lady Imogen would die tonight. Yes. They wished you to hear this prediction. Yes. And perhaps, how shall we say, to repeat it later. Lorne's eyes widened. I suppose so. Did they say why? They said it would soon be obvious who had ruined Lady Imogen. Inspector Cartwright looked up sharply. Ruined her? Yes. Poirot folded his hands behind his back, and naturally everyone would suspect the man who had already cost her £50,000. Lorne whispered, Yes. The implication spread slowly through the room. Inspector Cartwright spoke first. So the plan was to make you appear responsible for her death? Yes. And you still refuse to name the person who suggested it? Lorne's voice trembled. You do not understand. That person has influence, power, connections everywhere. Poirot's eyes moved slowly around the room. My friend, he said softly, you underestimate the influence of the truth. Lorne hesitated. Sylvia suddenly spoke. Whoever it was, she said, her voice unsteady but determined, they murdered my aunt. Her words seemed to break something in the man. He took a long breath. All right. Inspector Cartwright leaned forward. Well? Lorne's eyes moved across the faces gathered in the room. For a moment he seemed unable to continue. Then he said quietly, "It was Mrs. Trent." Every head turned toward the dark-haired woman near the window. Mrs. Viola Trent had not moved during the entire conversation. She now regarded Felix Lorne with an expression of calm astonishment. "That is quite an accusation," she said coolly. Inspector Cartwright's gaze fixed upon her. "Is it true that you spoke privately with Mr. Lorne before dinner?" She gave a small shrug. "I may have exchanged a few words with him in the gallery." "What did you say?" "I do not recall." Lorne's voice broke in. "You told me Lady Imogen would be dead before the night ended." Mrs. Trent looked at him with faint amusement. "My dear Mr. Lorne, you appear to be under considerable strain." Inspector Cartwright stepped forward. "Did you say those words or not?" "No?" "Then you deny it completely." "Of course." Poirot had been watching her very closely. He spoke now with quiet interest. "Madame, did you know that Lady Imogen suspected someone intended to kill her tonight?" Mrs. Trent's eyes flickered briefly. "No." "And yet you encouraged Monsieur Lorne to expect precisely that outcome." "I did nothing of the kind." Poirot nodded slowly. "Perhaps." Inspector Cartwright turned to Lorne. "You claim Mrs. Trent told you this murder would occur?" "Yes." Mrs. Trent smiled faintly. "How convenient." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Convenient?" "Yes. Mr. Lorne has just admitted losing Lady Imogen a great deal of money. He knows he's the obvious suspect. Naturally, he attempts to shift suspicion elsewhere." Inspector Cartwright considered this. "That is possible." Sylvia looked desperately from one to the other. "But why would Mrs. Trent want my aunt dead?" Poirot answered softly. "That is the question." His eyes rested thoughtfully on Mrs. Trent, and for the first time that evening the faintest hint of tension appeared in her composure. Poirot continued gently. "Madame, you avoided speaking with Dr. Annesley at dinner." Her expression hardened slightly. "What has that to do with anything?" "Perhaps nothing." Dr. Annesley looked puzzled. "I do not follow." Poirot gave a small, polite bow. "Patience, doctor. We are still arranging the pieces upon the board." Inspector Cartwright closed his notebook again. "Whether Mr. Lorne's accusation proves true or false, one fact remains." He glanced toward the staircase beyond the corridor. "Someone set that trap." Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes." His eyes returned to Mrs. Trent. "And someone ensured that a witness would predict the murder before it occurred." Mrs. Trent met his gaze steadily. "You are very fond of clever theories, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot smiled faintly. "Not theories, madame." He gestured lightly toward Felix Lorne. "Psychology." Then he added quietly, "And psychology tells me that tonight's murderer made one small mistake." Inspector Cartwright raised an eyebrow. "What mistake?" Poirot's eyes gleamed softly. "They believed that fear would silence Monsieur Lorne forever." The room fell silent again. And though Mrs. Trent's expression remained composed, I could not help noticing that her fingers had tightened slightly on the back of the chair beside her. For a few moments after Poirot spoke, no one moved. Mrs. Trent's composure returned almost immediately, yet there was now a faint rigidity about her posture that had not been there before. Inspector Cartwright regarded her thoughtfully. "Well, Mrs. Trent," he said, "perhaps you would care to explain why Mr. Lorne believes you warned him of Lady Imogen's death." She smiled faintly. "I cannot explain another person's imagination." Felix Lorne shook his head weakly. "It wasn't imagination." "You were agitated when we spoke," she replied coolly. "Perhaps you misunderstood." Poirot tilted his head. "Let us examine the matter calmly, madame." He began to pace slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Monsieur Lorne arrives early this evening. He has had a violent disagreement with Lady Imogen concerning the loss of £50,000. Naturally, he is anxious. Lorne nodded miserably. Then someone approaches him in the gallery, Poirot continued. This person informs him that Lady Imogen will die before the night ends. Inspector Cartwright interjected, which conveniently suggests that Lorne himself may intend to kill her. Exactly. Poirot stopped pacing. The psychology is elegant. If Monsieur Lorne repeats the prediction at dinner, as anxious men often repeat disturbing information, then when the death occurs, suspicion will fall upon him immediately. Cartwright nodded slowly. Yes, that part makes sense. Poirot looked at Mrs. Trent again. The only question is whether you are that person, madame. Her dark eyes held his steadily. You have no proof? No. Then your theory is worthless. Poirot smiled. On the contrary, it is merely incomplete. Inspector Cartwright leaned back slightly. What are we missing? Poirot gestured lightly toward the corridor leading to the gallery. We must consider the trap upon the staircase. Cartwright nodded. Yes. The thread was fixed recently, Poirot continued. Yet not at the exact moment Lady Imogen left the dining room. That would have been impossible. Because everyone was seated. Precisely. Which means the trap was prepared earlier. Yes. Poirot turned slowly. And therefore the murderer needed time alone in the gallery before dinner. Inspector Cartwright frowned. That narrows the possibilities. Very much. Sylvia spoke quietly. The gallery was open during the reception. Yes, but earlier than that. Poirot's eyes brightened slightly. That is the important question. Inspector Cartwright turned toward the housekeeper, who still hovered nervously near the door. When was the gallery last empty before the reception began? About 6:30, sir, and the staff finished cleaning it then. And when did the first guests arrive? Just before 7. Cartwright nodded thoughtfully. That leaves roughly 30 minutes. Poirot smiled faintly. A most convenient half-hour. Adrian Kellett spoke suddenly. Anyone could have used that time. Perhaps, said Poirot, but not everyone had a reason. Inspector Cartwright looked up. Meaning? Poirot turned toward Felix Lorne. Monsieur, when you waited in the gallery earlier this evening, did you notice anything unusual? Lorne thought for a moment. Yes. What? The thread. Everyone stared at him. You saw it, Cartwright said sharply. Lorne nodded slowly. Yes, though I didn't understand what it was at the time. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Please describe exactly what you saw. It was attached to the banister, Lorne said. No, but I thought it was simply part of the decorations, some thread from the cleaning, perhaps. Inspector Cartwright frowned. And you noticed it before dinner? Yes. Before the other guests arrived? Yes. Poirot's voice became very soft, which means the trap was already in place. Cartwright's head came up, before the reception even began. Exactly. The inspector's eyes moved across the room. That changes things. Mrs. Trent spoke coolly. In what way? Poirot answered. Because it means the murderer did not need to sneak away during dinner or the reception. The trap had been prepared long before Lady Imogen left the table. Sylvia whispered, but that means the murderer knew my aunt would eventually use the staircase. Yes, which suggests familiarity with the house. Inspector Cartwright nodded. This is someone who knew her habits. Judge Elmore spoke thoughtfully. She often used that staircase to reach her sitting room. Precisely, said Poirot. The inspector looked again at Mrs. Trent. Have you visited this house often? A few times. And Dr. Annesley? Many times, the doctor replied. And Mr. Heydrich? Occasionally. Inspector Cartwright made a small note. Poirot had stopped pacing. He stood very still now, studying each face in turn. Hastings, he said quietly to me. Do you notice something interesting? I'm afraid not. All of these people had some connection with Lady Imogen. Yes, but only one of them, Poirot continued thoughtfully, had both a personal motive. and the necessary knowledge to construct such a trap. Inspector Cartwright looked up. Which one? Poirot did not answer immediately, but instead he turned slowly toward Mrs. Trent. "Madame," he said gently, "you asked earlier why anyone would wish Lady Imogen dead." "Yes. Perhaps the answer lies not in money," he paused, "but in the past." Mrs. Trent's expression did not change. "I have no idea what you mean." Poirot regarded her steadily. "Dr. Annesley," he said quietly, "how long have you known Mrs. Trent?" The doctor looked surprised. "Nearly 8 years. And before that?" I do not recall meeting her earlier." Poirot nodded. "But Lady Imogen knew her longer." Mrs. Trent's voice hardened slightly. "You are speculating?" "Perhaps." Poirot turned back to Inspector Cartwright. "Inspector, earlier you asked why the murderer would warn Monsieur Lorne?" "Yes. Now we see why." Cartwright frowned. "I'm listening." Poirot gestured lightly toward Mrs. Trent. "Because the murderer needed someone else to appear guilty. And Lorne was the obvious candidate." "Exactly." Mrs. Trent laughed softly. "You weave a charming story, Monsieur Poirot." "Merci. But it proves nothing." "No." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Not yet." Inspector Cartwright leaned forward. "What are we waiting for?" Poirot glanced toward the door leading to Lady Imogen's private sitting room. "For one more detail." "What detail?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The reason Lady Imogen suspected someone intended to murder her tonight." Sylvia looked at him anxiously. "You think she discovered something?" "Yes." "Something important?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Something that gave the murderer no choice but to act." The room seemed to grow very still. Inspector Cartwright closed his notebook. "Bob, and you believe that discovery is in her sitting room?" Poirot's eyes sparkled faintly. "I am certain of it." Then he added softly, "And when we find it, the murderer will have nowhere left to hide." Inspector Cartwright wasted no time. "If there is something in Lady Imogen's sitting room," he said briskly, "we shall examine it at once." The small group moved again through the quiet corridor. A constable stood guard near the gallery staircase where the fatal trap had been discovered. The house felt almost unreal now, as though its elegant walls had become witnesses to something dark and intimate. Lady Imogen's sitting room still glowed with the steady lamplight we had left earlier. Poirot entered slowly. He did not immediately approach the writing desk again. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, to his eyes traveling over every detail, the orderly shelves, the polished surfaces, the carpet where no speck seemed out of place. Poirot had a particular reverence for order, and whenever he entered the private space of another meticulous mind, he treated it almost like a conversation. "Hastings," he said quietly, "observe the character of the room. It is extremely neat." "Exactly." Lady Imogen valued control. Inspector Cartwright stood beside the desk. "You believe she discovered something here?" "Yes." Poirot stepped closer to the writing table. The letter to Judge Elmore lay sealed in the evidence envelope, but several other papers remained on the desk. Bills, correspondence, a ledger book bound in dark leather. Poirot opened the ledger carefully. The pages contained columns of figures. Precise, deliberate entries recording financial transactions. Inspector Cartwright leaned forward. "Investments?" "Yes," said Poirot softly. Felix Lorne, who had followed reluctantly, looked miserable. "That is the account book she used to track my proposals." Poirot turned several pages. "What is it?" I asked. "These entries," Poirot said slowly. "They stopped 3 days ago." Lorne nodded. "Yes, that was when she realized the loss." Inspector Cartwright frowned. "Then the matter was already clear." "Not entirely," Poirot replied. He turned another page. "This entry is different." We leaned closer. The final line of the ledger was written more hastily than the others. Next to a series of numbers, Lady Imogen had written a short note. Confirmed transfer. Not Lorne. Inspector Cartwright straightened. Not Lorne? Poirot nodded. Yes. Lorne looked stunned. She believed I wasn't responsible. Apparently. But the investments. Poirot tapped the page lightly. The money disappeared, yes. But this suggests she discovered the true destination of the funds. Inspector Cartwright's eyes sharpened. And it wasn't Lorne. No, Sylvia whispered. Then who? Poirot closed the ledger gently. That is the interesting question. Inspector Cartwright looked around the room. You think someone else diverted the money? Yes. And Lady Imogen discovered it. Precisely. The inspector folded his arms. That gives us motive. Yes. Sylvia looked suddenly frightened. If my aunt discovered who stole the money. Poirot finished quietly. Then that person had a powerful reason to silence her. Felix Lorne sank weakly into a chair. Ah, my God. Inspector Cartwright turned toward the others. Which of you had access to Lady Imogen's financial matters? Lucien Hedrick spoke first. I advised her on the art purchases, not the investments. Dr. Annesley shook his head. I have no involvement in finance. Judge Elmore added calmly. I occasionally reviewed legal documents for her, but nothing concerning investments. All eyes slowly turned toward Mrs. Trent. She stood near the window, her dark silhouette framed by the curtains. Inspector Cartwright addressed her. Did you assist Lady Imogen with financial matters? No. Poirot spoke softly. But you knew about the investments. Her gaze shifted slightly. I heard them mentioned. Of course. Poirot walked slowly around the room again. Madame Trent, may I ask how long you have known Lady Imogen? Several years. And before that? I believe we met through mutual acquaintances. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Yet you and Dr. Annesley have known each other longer. The doctor looked surprised. That is true, though I fail to see. Poirot raised a finger gently. One moment, Doctor. His eyes remained on Mrs. Trent. You avoided speaking with Dr. Annesley at dinner. That proves nothing. No. Poirot smiled faintly. But psychology often reveals what evidence cannot. Inspector Cartwright said impatiently, Poirot, if you have something to say, in a moment. Poirot reached the window and looked out briefly at the quiet square beyond. Then he turned back. Monsieur Lorne, he said quietly, when Madame Trent spoke to you earlier this evening, well, what exactly did she say? Lorne hesitated. She told me Lady Imogen had discovered the truth about the money. Inspector Cartwright's head snapped up. She said that? Yes. And that Lady Imogen would be dead before the night ended? Yes. Poirot nodded slowly. Exactly as expected. Mrs. Trent's voice cut in coolly. You rely entirely on the testimony of a frightened man. Poirot looked at her calmly. No. He walked back to the desk and placed a finger lightly upon the ledger. I rely upon Lady Imogen's final discovery. Inspector Cartwright leaned forward. You think this ledger proves who stole the money? Yes. How? Poirot smiled faintly. Because the money was not transferred through a market loss. Then how? Poirot closed the ledger. It was withdrawn. By whom? Poirot looked slowly around the room. The only person who had both access to Lady Imogen's trust and the opportunity to manipulate the accounts. Mrs. Trent's expression hardened slightly. That is still speculation. Poirot inclined his head. Yes. Then he added quietly, until we consider one more fact. Inspector Cartwright waited. Poirot gestured toward Dr. Annesley. Doctor, how long ago did Mrs. Trent's husband die? The question seemed to strike the room unexpectedly. Dr. Annesley frowned. About 6 years ago. And how did he die? A financial scandal, the doctor said slowly. He took his own life. Poirot nodded gently, after Lady Imogen exposed his fraud. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Trent's eyes darkened. Poirot spoke very softly now. And that, mes amis, is where the true motive begins. For several seconds after Poirot spoke, and no one in the room moved, the revelation seemed to settle over us slowly, like dust disturbed after a long silence. Dr. Annesley looked troubled. I had not realized you knew about that matter, Poirot. Poirot inclined his head slightly. One does not forget such tragedies, Doctor. They leave traces in the human heart. Mrs. Trent had not spoken. She stood very still by the window, her face pale but composed. Yet the calm elegance she had maintained throughout the evening had altered subtly. There was now something sharper in her expression, something almost brittle. Inspector Cartwright folded his arms. "Mrs. Trent," he said quietly, "is it true that Lady Imogen exposed your husband's fraud?" She answered without hesitation. "Yes." "And he took his own life afterward?" "Yes." Her tone was perfectly steady, and Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. "That must have been a most painful experience." For the first time that evening, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. "Yes. And naturally," Poirot continued gently, "one does not easily forgive the person responsible." Mrs. Trent's eyes hardened. "You suggest I have spent 6 years plotting revenge?" "I suggest nothing," Poirot said mildly. "I merely consider human nature." Inspector Cartwright spoke again. "If Lady Imogen ruined your husband financially, that certainly provides motive." Mrs. Trent gave a small laugh. "How melodramatic." Felix Lorne spoke weakly from his chair. "But you told me she would die tonight." She turned her gaze toward him with faint contempt. "You are repeating that accusation again." "You said it." "Did I?" Her voice was cool, almost bored, and Inspector Cartwright stepped forward. "Mrs. Trent, I advise you to answer clearly." "I already have." Poirot walked slowly across the room again. "My dear madame," he said softly, "revenge is rarely a sudden impulse. It is more often a patient idea." She did not respond. Poirot continued. "For 6 years you watched Lady Imogen move comfortably through society, admired and respected. Meanwhile, your husband's name remained associated with disgrace." Dr. Annesley shifted uneasily. "That scandal was widely reported," he admitted. Poirot nodded. "Such wounds do not easily heal." Mrs. Trent's voice came quietly. "Are you finished with your lecture?" "Not quite." Poirot stopped near the desk. "You became friendly with Lady Imogen again over the past year. That is hardly a crime." "No, it is very intelligent." Inspector Cartwright frowned. "In what way?" Poirot answered. "Because it gave Mrs. Trent access to Lady Imogen's confidence." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You believe she learned about the investments?" "Exactly." Felix Lorne looked suddenly horrified. "You mean—" Poirot nodded. "Yes, monsieur." Cartwright spoke sharply. "Explain." Poirot turned slightly toward him. "Lady Imogen trusted Mrs. Trent. She may have discussed the investment arrangements with her. That knowledge allowed Mrs. Trent to manipulate the transfers." Inspector Cartwright glanced at the ledger. "So the money disappeared, but the blame appeared to fall on Lorne." "Precisely." Lorne buried his face in his hands. "My God." Sylvia looked pale, but my aunt wrote "not Lorne" in the ledger. "Yes." Poirot's voice grew quieter. "She discovered the truth." Inspector Cartwright nodded grimly. "And then once she discovered it, Mrs. Trent had to act quickly." "Exactly." Mrs. Trent spoke suddenly. "You assume a great deal." Poirot met her gaze calmly. "I observe." She smiled faintly. "And you believe I arranged the staircase trap?" "Yes." "That is quite a construction." Poirot gestured lightly toward the corridor. The thread was prepared before dinner. Only someone who knew Lady Imogen's habits would rely on that staircase. Mrs. Trent shrugged slightly. Many guests have visited this house, but few had such a powerful reason to kill her, Inspector Cartwright added quietly, and few would benefit from framing Mr. Lorne at the same time. The room fell silent again. Poirot watched Mrs. Trent closely. "Madame, you warned Monsieur Lorne deliberately. You wished him to repeat your words at dinner, and that ensured suspicion would fall upon him the moment Lady Imogen died." She said nothing. Poirot continued. Meanwhile, the trap awaited its victim. Dr. Annesley spoke suddenly. "But there is still one problem." Poirot turned toward him. "Yes? How could Mrs. Trent be certain Lady Imogen would leave the dining room and use the staircase?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Because she arranged it." Inspector Cartwright looked sharply at him. "How?" Poirot glanced toward the housekeeper standing near the door. "By ensuring the message from the housekeeper would arrive." The housekeeper gasped. "But I only delivered what I was told." "Exactly." Inspector Cartwright turned quickly. "Who asked you to call Lady Imogen upstairs?" The woman hesitated. I believe it was Mrs. Trent who mentioned earlier that Lady Imogen wished to check the arrangements for tomorrow's luncheon." All eyes swung back toward Mrs. Trent. For the first time that evening, she did not immediately answer. Poirot's voice was almost gentle. "A very neat plan." Inspector Cartwright stepped forward slowly. "Mrs. Trent, you arranged the message that drew Lady Imogen to the staircase." She remained silent. Poirot continued quietly. "And you ensured the trap was waiting." The silence stretched. At last Mrs. Trent laughed softly. It was not the warm laugh we had heard earlier at dinner. It was colder. "Very impressive, Monsieur Poirot." Inspector Cartwright stiffened. "Is that a confession?" "Not yet." Poirot regarded her calmly. "But you see now, madame, the game is nearly finished." Her eyes flashed briefly. "Ah, you are very sure of yourself." Poirot smiled. "No. Then what are you sure of?" Poirot's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "That Lady Imogen made one final discovery tonight." Inspector Cartwright frowned. "What discovery?" Poirot tapped the ledger lightly. "She discovered not only who stole the money," he paused, "but also how that person planned to kill her." The room seemed to tighten with suspense. Mrs. Trent's composure flickered again, just for a second. Poirot noticed, and in that moment I saw the familiar spark of triumph appear in his eyes. Because Hercule Poirot had just seen the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. The small flicker in Mrs. Trent's expression vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Yet Poirot had seen it. I knew the look in his eyes well, and it was the quiet satisfaction of a man whose final deduction had just been confirmed. Inspector Cartwright noticed it too. "You have something definite now, Poirot," he said. Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Yes," Mrs. Trent spoke coolly. "I would be interested to hear it." Poirot moved away from the desk and stood in the center of the room, facing us all. His posture was calm, almost conversational, but there was a quiet authority in his manner that seemed to gather everyone's attention. "Let us consider the sequence of events," he said softly. He raised one finger. "First, the theft of Lady Imogen's money. The investments proposed by Monsieur Lorne fail, or appear to fail. £50,000 disappears." Lorne winced. Poirot continued gently. "But Lady Imogen is not a careless woman. She examines her accounts carefully. 3 days ago, she discovers something unexpected." He tapped the ledger again. "Confirmed transfer. Not Lorne." Inspector Cartwright nodded slowly. "She discovered someone else had taken the money." "Exactly." Poirot lifted a second finger. "Second, the murderer realizes that discovery has been made. Once Lady Imogen understands the truth, exposure is inevitable." Sylvia whispered, "So she had to die." "Yes." Poirot looked toward Mrs. Trent. But killing her openly would be dangerous. The solution must be subtle, almost accidental. Inspector Cartwright said quietly. The staircase trap. Precisely. Poirot walked slowly across the room. The murderer prepares the trap earlier in the evening before the reception begins. A thin silk thread across the stair. Invisible. Simple. Effective. Cartwright nodded. And once Lady Imogen descends the staircase, Poirot finished softly. The fall breaks her neck. He raised a third finger, but there remains a difficulty. Suspicion must not fall upon the true murderer. Felix Lorne looked up. So I was chosen. Yes. Poirot gave a small sympathetic nod. You had the perfect motive, the missing money, the angry argument earlier that day. Inspector Cartwright added, and then came the warning. Poirot smiled faintly. Exactly. He turned toward Mrs. Trent again. The murderer approaches Monsieur Lorne privately in the gallery and plants a suggestion in his mind. Lady Imogen will die tonight. Lorne shivered, and I repeated it at dinner. Yes. Inspector Cartwright said grimly, so when the death occurred, everyone immediately suspected Lorne. Poirot nodded. A most elegant psychological trap. Mrs. Trent folded her arms. You still have not proven I was the one who set it. Poirot regarded her calmly. On the contrary, madame. He gestured lightly toward the housekeeper. You arranged the message that brought Lady Imogen upstairs. The housekeeper nodded nervously. Yes, sir. Mrs. Trent mentioned earlier that her ladyship wanted to check the luncheon arrangements. Inspector Cartwright said sharply, and Lady Imogen believed the message came from the housekeeper. Poirot added softly, which ensured she would leave the dining room and use the staircase. Mrs. Trent's voice remained controlled. That proves nothing. Poirot's eyes gleamed gently. There is still one final detail. Inspector Cartwright looked interested. What detail? Poirot turned back to the desk. When Lady Imogen discovered the theft 3 days ago, as she began to watch the person she suspected. Mrs. Trent did not move. Poirot continued. She noticed small things. A familiarity with her financial documents. Access to information that should have been private. Inspector Cartwright said quietly. And that person was someone she trusted. Yes. Poirot lifted the ledger again. Tonight she confirmed the truth. The money had not vanished through market losses. It had been transferred deliberately. To Mrs. Trent, Cartwright said. Mrs. Trent laughed softly. You have no proof of that. Poirot looked at her gently. But I have something better. What? The psychology. She raised an eyebrow. That again. Poirot nodded. Yes. He stepped closer to her now. Madame, when I mentioned your husband earlier, you did not react with surprise. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You already knew where this investigation was going. He paused. Because revenge has been your companion for 6 years. The room remained silent. Poirot continued softly. Lady Imogen exposed your husband's fraud. His disgrace destroyed your life. You waited patiently. When you gained her confidence again, you saw an opportunity. Mrs. Trent's voice was almost a whisper now. You are very imaginative, Monsieur Poirot. Merci. Poirot folded his hands. You diverted the investment funds to yourself. When Lady Imogen discovered the truth, you prepared the trap. Inspector Cartwright stepped forward. Mrs. Trent. But she suddenly spoke. Yes. The word came quietly. Everyone froze. Mrs. Trent looked at Poirot with a strange calm. You are correct. Sylvia gasped. You killed her? Mrs. Trent's eyes flickered briefly toward the young woman. Yes. Inspector Cartwright moved instantly. I must ask you to... But she continued speaking, her voice strangely steady. Lady Imogen destroyed my husband. She humiliated him before the entire city. Dr. Annesley said quietly, Your husband committed the fraud himself. Yes, she said. But she made certain the world knew it. Poirot regarded her with grave sympathy. Revenge is a poison, madame. Perhaps. She looked at him almost curiously. But it is a very patient poison. Inspector Cartwright stepped closer. Mrs. Trent, I must place you under arrest for the murder of Lady Imogen Vexley. She nodded faintly. I expected as much. The constable approached. Mrs. Trent allowed herself to be escorted from the room without resistance. As the door closed behind her, the tension that had filled the house seemed to release all at once. Sylvia sank into a chair. I cannot believe it. Inspector Cartwright turned to Poirot. Remarkable work. Poirot merely shrugged lightly. It was the psychology, Inspector. Felix Lorne looked at him with exhausted gratitude. You saved me. Poirot smiled gently. No, monsieur. The truth saved you. A little later, as we stepped out into the quiet London night, I glanced at my friend. Well, Poirot, I said, another mystery solved. He adjusted his gloves with great precision. Yes, Hastings. He paused thoughtfully. The curious thing about this affair was not the murder itself. No. Poirot shook his head slowly. It was the arrogance of the murderer. How so? He smiled faintly. They believed they could predict every reaction, every emotion, every thought. And they could not? Poirot's eyes twinkled softly. My friend, human psychology is a most delicate instrument. He tapped his forehead lightly. And it always leaves one small imperfection. I laughed. And what was that? Poirot's smile widened just a little. The little grey cells. Night had settled quietly over Belgrave Square by the time the house finally began to empty. The police had completed their immediate work. Servants moved softly through the halls, restoring a fragile sense of order, though the shadow of the evening's events lingered everywhere. Poirot and I remained in the drawing room with Inspector Cartwright, Sylvia Vexley, Judge Elmore, and Dr. Annesley. Felix Lorne had only recently recovered enough composure to sit upright without trembling. For a time, no one spoke. The fire burned low, and outside the windows, London continued its indifferent rhythm. Carriages passing, distant voices, the faint hum of the city that never truly sleeps. At last, Sylvia broke the silence. I still cannot understand one thing, she said quietly. Poirot turned toward her with gentle patience. Which thing, mademoiselle? How my aunt realized the truth tonight. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. Your aunt was a woman of order and intelligence. When the investments appeared to fail, she examined the figures carefully. At first, the evidence suggested that Monsieur Lorne had simply made poor decisions. Felix Lorne bowed his head miserably. But 3 days ago, Poirot continued, she noticed something unusual in the transfers. The funds had not vanished through market losses. They had been moved, deliberately. Inspector Cartwright nodded. And that is when she wrote in the ledger, not Lorne. Exactly. Dr. Annesley frowned slightly. But if she discovered Mrs. Trent's involvement, why invite her to dinner tonight? Poirot smiled faintly. Because Lady Imogen possessed a certain courage. Judge Elmore nodded slowly. That was very like her. She suspected someone intended to harm her, Poirot continued, yet she preferred to confront the matter directly rather than hide from it. That is why she wrote the letter to you, Judge Elmore. Yes, the judge said quietly. A precaution. Precisely. She wished the truth to emerge if anything happened to her. Sylvia shivered slightly, and instead, it led to her death. Poirot's expression softened. Unfortunately, the murderer realized that discovery had been made. Inspector Cartwright leaned forward. There is one thing I should like clarified, he said. Poirot nodded. Of course. When Mrs. Trent warned Lorne earlier in the evening, she risked exposing herself. Why take that chance? Poirot clasped his hands together. Because fear is an excellent instrument. Felix Lorne looked up weakly. She terrified me. Yes. Poirot nodded sympathetically. She knew you had already quarreled with Lady Imogen that afternoon. You feared ruin, scandal, arrest. Under such strain, when someone tells you something shocking, such as the prediction of a death, you repeat it almost involuntarily. Inspector Cartwright gave a small smile. And once he repeated it at dinner, suspicion would fall upon him instantly. The inspector nodded. A clever piece of psychological misdirection. Poirot raised a finger, but not perfect. What betrayed her? Sylvia asked quietly. Poirot smiled gently. Several things. He began to pace slowly across the room. First, the warning to Monsieur Lorne. That was too deliberate. A truly cautious murderer would never introduce an unpredictable element into the plan. Inspector Cartwright nodded. Yes. Second, Mrs. Trent's behavior at dinner. She avoided speaking with Dr. Annesley. The doctor looked puzzled again. I still failed to see the significance. Poirot stopped pacing. My dear doctor, you attended the scandal surrounding Mrs. Trent's husband 6 years ago, and you knew the details intimately. Yes. If she had conversed with you freely this evening, there was always the possibility that the past might be mentioned. Dr. Annesley's expression changed slowly. I see. Poirot nodded. She wished to keep that history as distant from Lady Imogen's death as possible. Inspector Cartwright leaned back thoughtfully. And the final clue? Poirot smiled faintly. The ledger. Because Lady Imogen had already written, not Lorne. Exactly. Poirot folded his hands. That note proved the money had been traced elsewhere. The moment I saw it, I knew the murderer must be someone who had both access to Lady Imogen's trust and a powerful motive connected to the past. Sylvia spoke softly. Revenge. Yes. The young woman lowered her gaze. I wish my aunt had trusted someone enough to tell us what she discovered. Poirot's voice was kind. She intended to, I think, but the murderer acted first. Inspector Cartwright rose and closed his notebook. Well, Poirot, I must say this has been one of the more unusual cases I've encountered. Poirot smiled modestly. Each case is unusual in its own way. Felix Lorne stood slowly. I owe you my life, or at least my reputation. Poirot waved a hand gently. You owe the truth, monsieur. Nothing more. Lorne hesitated. I shall do everything possible to restore Lady Imogen's lost money. Judge Elmore regarded him sternly. You will certainly try. Sylvia looked at Poirot with quiet gratitude. My aunt admired clever minds, she said. She would have appreciated what you did tonight. Poirot inclined his head politely. Dears, that is most kind. A short while later, Hastings and I stepped out into the cool night air. Belgrave Square lay calm beneath the glow of the street lamps. The events of the evening already seemed strangely distant, as though the house behind us held the memory while the city continued forward without pause. I walked beside Poirot in thoughtful silence for several moments before speaking. Well, Poirot, I said, it began with a most extraordinary statement at dinner. Yes, and in the end, that very statement exposed the murderer. Poirot nodded slowly. Indeed. But I must admit, I added, it still astonishes me that someone could predict a murder before it happened. Poirot's mustaches twitched with quiet amusement. My dear Hastings, the prediction was never the mystery. No. He tapped his forehead lightly. The real mystery was why the prediction was made. And the answer? Poirot smiled softly as we turned down the quiet street. The answer, my friend, lies always in the same place. The little grey cells. Precisely. He paused, glancing back once toward the darkened windows of Lady Imogen's house. In the end, every crime reveals something about the human heart. And what did this one reveal? Poirot considered for a moment. That revenge may wait patiently. He straightened his tie with perfect precision. But truth, Hastings, is even more patient. Then Hercule Poirot gave a small, satisfied nod, and together we walked on into the quiet London night.